Welcome back to the deep dive. You've brought us, well, quite a collection of sources today.
Yeah, we've got think tank analyses, research papers, news reports, even some public opinion data.
And it's all focused on a topic that really shook things up: Donald Trump's approach to trade, specifically his use of tariffs and quotas.
That's right. We're looking at perspectives from places like the Hudson Institute, Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, among others. A real mix.
So our mission, as always, is to dive into this material. We want to pull out the core insights, the arguments, the impacts, really understand the different viewpoints presented here.
Especially since trade policy under Trump was such a significant shift, It sparked intense debate even within conservative circles, as these sources show.
Absolutely. Okay, let's unpack this.
And these sources, they really lay out some fascinating contrasts. Fundamentally different ideas about what trade policies should even do.
Let's jump right into those then. So drawing from groups like Cato, AEI, that piece analyzing modern trade policy, one view is that these policies were a radical departure.
A really sharp break from decades of U.S. policy and, frankly, global norms.
Right. The argument being that using tariffs so broadly kind of undermined the whole rules-based international system.
Exactly. Made the U.S. seem more inward-looking, created a lot of uncertainty. It felt like reversing this long trend towards globalization that the U.S. itself had, for the most part, championed.
And there's this view, one source says it's widely held among economists, that higher tariffs are just, well, bad for the economy.
Precisely. The core argument is they raise costs. For consumers buying goods, for businesses needing imported parts or materials.
Which could lead to job losses in those industries, potentially, and slow down growth overall.
That's the fear. And critics in these sources, they also hit on the justifications, or maybe the lack thereof, pointing out that the reasons given often seem to lack clear economic analysis.
Cato had that quote about reciprocal tariffs.
Yeah, calling the math behind them shoddy guesstimates detached from economic reality. Strong words.
It sounds like it. And there's also a hint in one source, a suggestion that maybe the real motive wasn't just economic strategy.
Right. Maybe it was more about protectionism, helping specific groups, perhaps through market manipulation or even political ties. That concern is definitely raised.
Larry Summers, he had a pretty stark quote mentioned in one piece.
He did. Called them the most radical trade policies since the Second World War. That really captures how much of a fundamental break it felt like to some observers.
And Thomas Sowell's warning, too, about risking an economic downturn, replaying devastating history.
Yes, Sowell's point, as presented here, was interesting. He contrasted it with someone like FDR, saying even past experiments happened within a known framework.
But this was different.
He argued the danger comes when, as he put it, you're the one who's making the rules. That kind of unpredictability, he suggested, makes businesses and people just hold on to their money.
Like investing.
Right. Which could potentially slow things down, maybe even trigger the kind of downturn seen, during the Depression era.
Serious warning. Okay, so that's a powerful critique laid out in these sources. Disruptive, economically harmful, unpredictable. But then other sources, especially from Hudson Institute and commentary from Heritage, they offer a totally different take.
They really do. Hudson suggests a lot of the criticism might be tied up with views on Trump himself, not just the policy.
How so?
They argue, look, a tariff is basically just a tax. It's not inherently immoral. It's not necessarily a diplomatic attack. And crucially, they push back hard on this idea that free trade ever really existed in the first place.
They're saying the system was already protectionist.
Yeah, they call the global system a messy patchwork, where pretty much all countries use protectionist measures against American goods anyway.
So the strong reaction to Trump's tariffs seemed disproportionate to them.
Or maybe hypocritical, yeah. They point to things like the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBM.
Which is basically a tariff on carbon content.
Exactly. Just another way policy changes incentives for companies, similar in principle, they argue, to what Trump's tariffs aim to do.
So what's the core argument from Hudson then? Why use tariffs?
Their central point is that the old anti-tariff mindset in the U.S. focused too much on short-term consumer benefits. They call it consumer welfarism.
At the expense of what?
At the expense of long-term national interests, broader societal needs, like domestic manufacturing and reliable energy.
For national security reasons.
That's a huge part of it. They point to America's ability to ramp up production in past world wars. You need that domestic industrial base, they argue, for security.
They even brought Adam Smith into it, which might surprise some people.
It might. But They cite the wealth of nations, where Smith actually said sometimes burdening foreign goods to encourage domestic industry is appropriate, specifically for national security.
Like for ship sales back then.
Right. And Hudson argues that principle still applies today, just to different things, maybe semiconductors or critical minerals, not just sales and gunpowder. They also link manufacturing directly to innovation.
Pointing to places like Taiwan.
Exactly. Yeah. Taiwan didn't just rely on free markets for semiconductors. They used deliberate industrial policy. Hudson says manufacturing drives innovation.
Okay, so pulling that thread, the main goal of the tariffs from this perspective was strategic reindustrialization.
Pretty much. Use tariffs to give U.S. producers an edge in their own market, aiming to rebuild manufacturing capacity and spark innovation here at home.
And E.J. Antoni from Heritage added another layer about the trade deficit and inflation.
Yeah, he argued that the U.S. trade deficit has basically been financed by the Fed printing money, which fuels inflation.
And his quote was quite direct about prioritizing Americans.
Very direct. Free trade should apply first and foremost to domestic trade. We don't hate foreigners. We just love Americans more. It really underscores that America first economic perspective.
Okay, so two very different philosophies about what trade policy should achieve. Let's dig into some specifics now. Impacts, examples from the sources. One really basic point that comes up again and again, Heritage, Cato, even online comments, is who actually pays the tariff.
Right, and this is key because it's often misunderstood. The sources are very clear. Tariffs are taxes, and they're paid by the importer in the country that imposes the tariff.
So U.S. businesses or individuals pay, not China, not Mexico, not the EU.
Correct. Heritage puts it plainly. It's standard practice now for the buyer, the importer, to pay the tariff, not the seller overseas.
And Cato called the idea that other countries pay a ploy.
A ploy to quickly raise taxes on imports.
Yeah, even those online comments you found show regular people get this. Tariff money is pouring out of the pockets of U.S. consumers, one said. Another noted it goes right to the government, not from other countries.
Understanding that seems fundamental to judging the policy.
Absolutely, because if U.S. entities are paying, then what are the effects here at home?
Which leads to the next point. The negative impacts these sources describe on certain U.S. industries and supply chains.
Yeah, and there's a really concrete example in the sources, Mid-Continent Steel and Wire, based in Missouri.
What happened to them? Well, they import steel wire rod to make nails and other products. The 25% steel tariff hit them hard. They had to raise prices for their customers by 19%.
Customers who are already paying more for U.S.-made nails.
Right, the result. A 60% drop in sales.
No.
They had to lay off 80 employees, cut back on investments. It's a stark example of how a tariff on an input can hurt a domestic manufacturer.
So it's not just finished goods, it's the raw materials and components businesses need. What about quotas? Are they different?
They can be, yeah. Sometimes even tougher than tariffs, according to Heritage. A strict quota can just completely cut a business off from needed supplies if there isn't a good domestic alternative.
Like for very specialized things.
Exactly. The sources mention specialized steel pipe for the oil and gas sector. Maybe U.S. mills can't easily make that specific type. A quota could just block supply, especially if demand suddenly surges.
And there are also tariff rate quotas, a mix.
Right. Like with sugar. You can import a certain amount at a low tariff, but anything above that faces a huge tariff or is blocked by the quota.
And the effect.
The sources say it's made sugar way more expensive in the U.S. So much so that some companies, like candy makers who absolutely need sugar, have actually moved production out of the U.S. to avoid those high costs.
Wow. So tariffs, quotas, they all introduce distortions, uncertainty.
Definitely. Heritage points out they mess with the efficient allocation of resources. Prices get artificially changed, supply chains get disrupted. And that brings us back to Thomas Sowell's point about uncertainty.
When the government is making the rules,
businesses get nervous. They hold back on investment. They hang on to their money, as Sowell put it. And that hesitation spread across the economy can contribute to a slowdown.
Now, a lot of this debate, as presented in the sources, seems to circle back to one country in particular, China. Hudson Institute especially argues China's unique system is a key driver here.
Yeah, they make a strong case that China isn't just another competitor like, say, Japan was in the 80s.
Why different?
Scale, for one. China's impact is just much bigger. Plus, its authoritarian government and its explicit strategic goals challenging the U.S., challenging the international order, make it a fundamentally different kind of challenge.
And how does its system affect trade specifically?
According to Hudson, China uses everything, state power, laws, regulations, money, to heavily subsidize its companies, ensure state-owned firms dominate key sectors, lock up foreign markets through things like the Belt and Road Initiative,
And things like intellectual property theft.
facilitating forced or illegal IP transfers, and relying on opaque political deals.
Yeah.
The argument is, this isn't market competition. It actively undermines the market principles that globalization was supposed to be built on.
There was an OECD report mentioned on subsidies.
Right. It found Chinese industrial subsidies were just vastly larger than other countries. In some critical sectors, subsidies were over 15% of revenue. And those subsidized firms gained huge market share globally.
Hudson connects this to the structure within China, the party's role.
Exactly. With Communist Party committees inside firms, laws like the National Intelligence Law, Hudson says this lets the party state blatantly manipulate markets and distort competition in ways that are really hard for outsiders to even track, let alone counter.
Which makes it tough for organizations like the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
A huge challenge.
Yeah.
The WTO rules just weren't really designed for a hybrid system like China's. How do you prove illegal subsidies when the links between the party, the state, and companies are so deep and often hidden?
And China's unlikely to agree to change the rules.
Hudson argues probably not, because those very practices are central to achieving their big strategic goals, like the Made in China 2025 plan. Changing the rules would mean giving up their core strategy.
So beyond the economics and the China strategy, these tariffs also ended up in court, didn't they?
They did. Sources like CNN and The Briefing highlight a pretty significant federal court ruling that actually halted some of the tariffs.
And the legal reasoning was interesting. It involved theories used elsewhere.
Yeah, the court leaned partly on legal ideas that conservative groups have used in other cases, including challenges against the Biden administration.
You mean the major questions doctrine?
That's the main one. It's this idea, which the Supreme Court has used more recently, that Congress needs to be really explicit. Speak clearly is the phrase, when it gives the executive branch power to do things with huge economic or political significance.
And the court applied that to the tariffs.
It questioned whether Congress had really given the president such broad, clear authority to impose tariffs this sweeping. It even touched on whether Congress might have improperly given away too much of its own legislative power.
And CNN linked this to other big cases.
Yeah, like the Supreme Court using the same doctrine to block the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness plan and some EPA climate regulations.
So it shows how these legal arguments about executive power cut across different issues and administrations.
Exactly. It's about the balance of power between Congress and the president, especially on these really big policy shifts. The court also briefly mentioned the related non-delegation doctrine.
Okay, one last area your sources touched on, public opinion. How do people feel about all this, particularly around free trade?
Well, the Pew Research data you included shows a pretty clear divide along political lines.
Especially among Republicans.
Yeah, specifically among Republican voters, Trump supporters really stood out in the 2016 data presented.
How so?
A large majority, 67% of Trump supporters surveyed back then, said free trade agreements have been a bad thing for the U.S. Only 27% thought they were good.
Which was different from supporters of other Republicans at the time.
Right. Supporters of candidates like Cruz or Kasich had more mixed views, and Democratic supporters, whether for Clinton or Sanders, were generally much more positive about free trade deals.
Any interesting demographic splits in that data?
A few, yeah. Black and Hispanic respondents were generally more supportive of the agreements than white respondents, who were more divided. Women tended to be more favorable than men, especially white men, and younger people were significantly more positive than older folks, particularly those 65 and up.
Okay, so let's try to pull these threads together. We've seen this complex, very debated picture emerge from your sources.
Definitely. On one side, you have this view. Tariffs are basically taxes on Americans. They disrupt global norms, mess up supply chains, and hurt the economy.
But on the other side, there's this perspective that, well, maybe these measures are necessary tools, that true free trade doesn't really exist anyway.
And that you need these tools to protect domestic industries, protect national security, especially when dealing with state-controlled economies like China's.
And the sources show different conservative viewpoints too, right? Not monolithic.
Not at all. Some conservatives deeply critical of the economic fallout from the tariffs, others really supportive of the strategic thinking behind them, the focus on national interest, rebuilding industry here.
It feels like it boils down to a fundamental tension revealed in these sources. What's the main goal of trade policy? Is it maximizing consumer welfare right now through efficiency and low prices?
Or is it about building long-term national resilience, protecting domestic jobs and industries, even if that means higher costs in the short term?
And it's clearly not just an economic debate. It pulls in national strategy, the role of government, how you compete with different kinds of economies.
Exactly. All tangled together.
So thinking about everything these sources brought up, who pays tariffs, the impact on businesses, the whole China situation, the legal fights, public opinion, it leaves you wondering, what is the right balance for U.S. trade policy going forward?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
Is it even possible to get both? That economic efficiency and the national resilience, some sources argue, is vital. Can trade policy actually deliver both? What really stands out to you from this deep dive?